Blog Talk Radio.
Good afternoon. Chuck Morse, host of Chuck Morse Speaks. Welcome to the program. We'll be joined shortly by Larry Schweikart. He is the co-author, along with Dave Dougherty, of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the American Revolution. This is a book that I'm about 3 chapters in at this point. I'm looking forward to having Larry on the program at Tufts University once the students are back in September. It gives a solid and, not, I wouldn't say conservative, but actually more conventional view of the circumstances around the American Revolution. And it's not filled with the ideology of the left, people like Howard Zinn who view it in a Marxist context that it was, a war to overthrow the rich and this sort of stuff. He talks about, and I think quite eloquently and quite well in a very well documented format, the fact that the American Revolution was a Protestant revolution. It was a conservative revolution in the sense that it embraced some of the best elements of the Enlightenment. It embraced the idea of rights emanating from God as opposed to the state, something that was articulated by a man that could be described as the grandfather of the American Revolution, that being James Otis, and James Otis's sister, who is unsung among feminists for reasons that are interesting, that being Mercy Otis Warren, and that it was essentially a reassertion of sovereign rights by the citizen as they had become more usurped by a more activist British Crown and Parliament. And it gets into the fact that the American Revolution really started very much at the very beginning with the Mayflower Compact, with other documents that essentially recognized and established the sovereign rights of citizens. This was the beginning of the move away from the crown. Basically, the book gets into all of these things in a very succinct way. Larry, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks, Chuck. Sorry, I just now saw the note. I was to call in. Sorry, I would have been here 2 minutes ago.
No, that's okay. And I want to have you back once Tufts University is back in session, where I do a show that's gaining a lot of notoriety on that campus, as you might imagine. But right now, I just want to get into I've read the first 3 chapters, and they're excellent, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the American Revolution. And you set up an interesting examination of the true antecedents of the revolution, pointing out that it really started right at the beginning with the Mayflower Compact. Can you talk a little bit about the mindset and the viewpoint of the early colonists and how that contributed to the American Revolution?
Absolutely. I mean, they, with the exception of the Jamestown colonists, who were a little different because they came over primarily for economic motives, for gold, silver, and so forth. The Massachusetts colonists, both the Pilgrims and later the Puritans, came over for religious freedom from the Anglican Church. They wanted to purify the Church of England. The Pilgrims did not think it could be done within England. They had to leave. The Puritans, who came over under John Winthrop, were not of that same viewpoint, but they still shared something with the Pilgrims, and that was they all believed in a congregational structure for the church, in which people in each church congregation made their own governance. They governed themselves. They didn't have a top-down pope, bishop, archbishop setup, or Archbishop of Canterbury in the Church of England. And this was critically important over the next 150 years because even in the Presbyterian churches that started to develop a lot of local bottom-up governance in religion that went hand in hand with the common law that all these people were seeing. And the common law had...
Yep.
Go ahead. Well, the common law had to do with
go ahead.
The common law had to do with the fact that people believed God put the law in the hearts of the people, and that the people, again, elected or selected rulers who would enact that law, as opposed to European divine right of kings, top down, which later was picked up by Napoleon. So in both cases, you had a structure, government and religion, that was bottom up, was grassroots, as opposed to being dictatorial, tyrannical, or top down.
Well, what you described is one of the most keystone elements of the American ethos, which is the rights come from the Creator and not from the state. And in a sense, it's that very principle which makes this nation exceptional. You know, it was the first time, or at least in a major sense, that this concept was recognized. It is a concept that's in the Bible. It's in the New Testament as well. And, it basically led to this idea that the state does not grant rights. The state simply protects and is a means by which we can defend God-given rights that are inalienable, as Thomas Jefferson said. And as far as the congregational element,
that's absolutely right. And if you look at England, that they institutionalized this with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where Parliament put the crowns on the head of the King and Queen, William and Mary. But already we had 60 years of basically practicing this common law. So we predated the Glorious Revolution in England, meaning we were the first nation in history to do this, and we were the only nation to have both a significant Protestant religious foundation, and common law foundation. Nobody else has that, and that's why America is exceptional, not because we wrote stuff down, but because we had these two factors no one else had.
Right, and then also our Constitution and our laws are negative laws in the real sense. They're not saying we're going to do this for you. What they're saying is that the government essentially will not do this so that you can do it. These are, in a sense, laws that recognize the natural rights of the citizen. Now, as far as the congregational element, I just want to comment. I'm from Boston, and I've noticed that congregational churches, they can be either very far left or they can be very far right. They can be very conservative. It depends on the congregation, and it depends on what their makeup. And I think that's the classic American model. I mean, we recognize the right of the individual and the right of associations, which are individuals getting together for common purpose, to craft their own way and to reflect their own values. And that's something that's quite unique. Now, you talk about the Scotch-Irish influence on the American Revolution, which is something that I didn't really know much about. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. Virtually all of the Southern campaigns were fought significantly by the Scots-Irish in North Carolina, Southern Virginia, South Carolina. And these people were strongly anti-Anglican. Again, here's the religious aspect, that they are anti-Anglican church. They don't like the top-down kind of governance for the Anglican church. And, of course, many of these guys are militias. But I think one estimate is that, a half to 60% of the fighting in the Revolution was conducted by Scots-Irish. So they play a key role in our freedom.
Now, you talk about the Stamp Act as being one of the trigger points of the Revolution because the colonists had genuine fear that this was a step toward denying religious freedom in America. Could you talk about that?
Sure. Stamp Act was an act by the British government that required a sales stamp and thus a tax on almost everything. Every transaction, business transaction, weddings, divorces, births, deaths, almost everything required a stamp. And eventually the reasoning was, look, if they can tax all these things and they can tax everything that involves a paper document, whether it's a birth certificate or a death, how long before they are going to be taxing Bibles? Now, this may be kind of who would really logically believe that? But you have to understand that to the Protestants, especially the Puritans in New England, reading the Bible for oneself was a key element of their religion and a very big difference between themselves and the Anglicans or the Catholics who did not read the Bible for themselves. And so anything that threatened that was a threat to the very religious existence of the country. And then, by the way, look what happened later, 10 years later. So you have the Quartering Act, and what do? England, as punishment for the Tea Party in 1773, one of the Quartering Acts that people don't talk much about is that they reallocated the American colonies under the authority of Quebec. It's called the Quebec Act. And who's in Quebec? Well, those evil Catholic French. I mean, it keeps coming back to this fear of. And I got to tell you, I had a great quotation, and I don't bring these out of thin air. When I see a quotation, I get it from someplace, but I swear I cannot find where I got this from, so I haven't used it. But it was ascribed to John Adams, and it said that prelates and lawn sleeves are more to be feared than a division of redcoats.
No, I believe that. I mean, especially in Massachusetts, there was that was part of what actually precipitated the witch trials. But that's another subject. The point is that the British drew a line across the Appalachians and basically banned Western expansion by settlers, and instead placed it, at least in a nominal sense, under the authority of the Quebecers, which of course meant that the Catholics would eventually settle the Ohio Valley, and that drove the colonists nuts.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the proclamation line, because the British actually vacillated on this. They went back and forth, I think, 3 times. And part of the proclamation line was, they're not going to allow settlers west of this line in the Appalachians. Well, 2 things. Already people were settling there. So that was a case of the government acting against the wishes of the people. Had it been the American colonial government, they would have figured out a way to basically legalize those people. But the other thing that happened was that various traders and merchants had various contracts with the government for being able to deal with the Indians, and now all of those were suddenly null and void, and so that was another economic issue. And Dave Dougherty and I make very clear the revolution was not about money. That it's estimated that the burdens of the Navigation Act probably came in 1770 to about, at the high end, $1 a person a year, and at the low end, $0.25 a person a year. Nobody's going to go to war over $1 a year, even back then. But the money was an indicator of what the British government was doing and how they were doing it, and that concerned everybody.
I want to ask you something that I don't think is covered in your book, and it's just I don't want to go too far into it in a brief sense, but the colonists, starting with Massachusetts, had begun issuing their own money, what they call scrip, and it was based upon low-interest loans to farmers and businessmen, and the interest would go into the state treasuries or the colonial treasuries and used to build infrastructure. It was interest-free money. It was paper money. It was not backed by gold or silver, and it was extremely successful. It led to it contributed to a great prosperity. Benjamin Franklin went to England, and he was asked by members of Parliament what contributed to this great success. And according to what I understand to be in his diaries, he said the success is that we have our own money. And the British looked upon that, and they said, no, we have to stop this. So they passed a law. They sent out a decree. I think it was in the 1750s.
Currency Act.
50s.
No, the Currency Act.
That's right. Which they banned colonial scrip, and they said that all monies, all transactions, and all taxes have to be paid in gold, which is very scarce, of course. And the Bank of England would maintain a monopoly on the issuance of any currency. And this led to a depression for the first time in history on the Western world, which was greatly a contributor to the American Revolution. And one of the first acts of the Second Continental Congress was to issue continental scrip. And this drove the British nuts. This was one of the things that contributed to their full-scale invasion, basically, of the American colonies.
Well, the history of paper money is very interesting. There's a debate over whether or not the phrase Congress has the authority to coin money in the Constitution means actual metal coin or any kind of money. I've written a number of books on business and economic history. It was my specialty for many, many years. And my own position is that I don't mind a central bank as long as other banks are allowed to compete with it in terms of money. The problem isn't that people could print money. The problem is that there was not enough competition with a central bank to keep it honest.
Right.
A central bank will be kept honest if it has to compete with private monies. And I've always said if you want to rein in the Fed, the best thing to do would be allow Chase and Citibank to print their own money. but you're absolutely right.
Not to mention that Hamilton's Bank, which had a 20-year charter, the first central bank, that was mostly owned by the government in the same way that the Massachusetts Land Bank was owned by the Bay Colony, and that it only became corrupted in the second bank period. That's when Andrew Jackson came along, a great Scots-Irishman, by the way, who took on the bank as an imperial usurper of political power, which it had become. I take exception. I take exception to that. In Patriots History of the United States, we present a different take, which again is the bank was not particularly corrupt. It was actually pretty good. The state bankers loved the Bank of the United States. We had great prosperity. What Jackson wanted, and I'm apparently the only one to ever find these letters in his collection. I don't know why I can find it, nobody else can't, but there's many letters in his collection that indicate Jackson liked a central bank. He just didn't want a central bank that wasn't controlled by him. And he set out Levi Woodbury to create a whole new central bank structure that the Democrats would control, and that's why he was hell-bent on destroying the Bank of the United States. It wasn't that he disliked banks, period. It's like he didn't like weak banks. No, that's fascinating. I mean, I'm actually doing some research on this topic for a book myself, so, I mean, that's really helpful. You talk about in the lead up to the revolution, the development of the Articles of Association,
yes,
which was the beginning of the boycott of English products, and it also coincided with the development of local militias. Their actions were not always savory. What interests me is the fact that militias, which were recognized by local communities or counties, that they existed in this country right up to 1909, I think. Can you talk a little bit about their involvement in the revolution?
Sure. Well, first let's quickly explain these associations. The association in general and the associations under them wasn't a 60s rock band that did Along Comes Mary. The associations were documents signed by all of the merchants and farmers and artisans in thousands of towns and cities that said, we're going to boycott British goods. We're not going to support England economically at all. And it led to a decline of almost 90% of trade with England and hurt England quite a bit. Well, merely putting your name on those association lists would open you to charges of treason, certainly, other lesser charges. In other words, it was not a small thing to sign on to the association list. It marked you as a rebel, or of course, as we would call them, a patriot. Now, the militias, there's two, I'm sure you know this, there's two types of militias. There's the general militia, which was every able-bodied man, I think down to 16 up to 60, had to turn out once a month for drill with musket and flint powder, that sort of stuff. But the ready militia was a certain select number of men from each county who had to maintain 30 rounds of ammunition, flints, and powder and so forth, and be ready to turn out, at a minute's notice, which is where we get the Minuteman thing. And so, we were very much bottom up whether it was from the associations or from the militias. The whole war was a bottom-up exercise.
That feeds into the modern ethos of law enforcement and policing being something that is local in America, and that technically the highest law enforcer in the land is the county sheriff. That when the FBI was created, it was not given law enforcement authority, still isn't. It was basically nothing more than an investigatory entity that would help law enforcement crack crime. But, this is something that in America, we've always rejected a national police or a national, even there's always been controversy around a standing army. You point out that Washington, after Yorktown, advocated just a small national army that would essentially train officers who would then supplement local militias in time of conflict.
Well, and that's also Jefferson's view when he becomes president. So it's interesting that Jefferson, one of the more pacifistic, if you want to use that phrase, of the early presidents,
sure,
create the West Point, the Army Military Academy, to do just that, to train officers. Getting back to the police function, the theory behind that local control idea is, John Brown is out there causing a ruckus and getting drunk and so forth. The local people know him. They know his antics, his actions. They know what he's more likely to do. They know if he's serious or not serious. And if law enforcement comes from higher levels, you lose that local knowledge that may prevent trouble or keep it contained. And, of course, the civil rights movement comes along, and they say, well, that's just an excuse for using this local knowledge to keep people down. So there's been this struggle between the civil rights side and the local knowledge side. One side sees it as a good thing, and the other side sees it as a bad thing.
Oh, now, Larry, I'm going to have you back on, hopefully, once school's back over at Tufts, so that we can reach the Tufts audience. And you talk about this being your book, that being the politically incorrect guide to the American Revolution, as a counter-revolution view by today's standards, whereas the mainstream revolution view is influenced by people like the late Professor Howard Zinn and other leftist activists. What is their view of the American Revolution, and how does yours differ?
Well, typically the leftists view the American Revolution as instigated by a group of rich white slave owners who are trying – it's all economics. It's all economic determinism. They're trying to protect their position in society, and I think that's why our book just blows these out of the water, because once you understand that the associations were the precursor to the Declaration, that argument's dead. Because the associations were tens of thousands of ordinary people, 90% of them not slave owners. Many of them had never even seen a slave. And their goal was not to be oppressed by the British. And once again, it had less to do with money and the level of taxation than it did with the policies of how the taxes were enacted without any consultation with the colonists and denying them, as they would say over and over again, their rights as Englishmen.
So then the American Revolution was a genuine, organic movement of regular people who were essentially saying that we want to reassert our right to sovereignty, our right to our own destiny, and that we feel that this distant power, this tyrannical, unelected power, is usurping those rights. And in that sense, the American Revolution, you point out, was probably one of the only, if not the only, successful revolution in history. And you contrast it with the French Revolution and with revolutions in modern times in Africa and elsewhere. What was it that made the American Revolution as such, and contrast that with these others?
Sure. Well, we go right back to what I started the program discussing, which is the things that made America exceptional. Two of the four pillars are key here, and that's common law and a mostly Protestant religious foundation, both of which are bottom-up governance. And so when you get to the French Revolution, you have a society in which the revolution is the religion in the country is top down, and the revolution itself is anti-religious, whereas the American Revolution was very pro-religious, and you have church after church supporting the notion of revolution in America. The other thing that you have in France is a top-down governance. They were used to being governed by Louis XVI, and when he was gone, it's not a bottom-up governance that takes over. What takes over? It's Robespierre, and then that's followed by Napoleon, and Napoleon goes so far as to codify all of the top-down governance in what's called civil law, so that when France expands and gets colonies, and when Napoleon conquers all of Europe, virtually all of Europe, all the way to Russia, is controlled now by a form of civil law. Common law is replaced by civil law, which is top-down. The government knows what's best. And then finally, you look at Russia, the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution was not a revolution so much as a coup staged by Lenin and about 80,000 of his devout followers. It wasn't Marxist, as we point out in our book, Patriots, History of the Modern World. It didn't follow one single Marxist precept. Rather, it was just a military takeover by a group of terrorists, and they were tougher and meaner than all of their opponents put together.
And also the reason why these other revolutions failed, whether it be the French Revolution or the Bolshevik coup or others, is that they promised more freedom and an end of oppression in their countries, but they delivered less freedom and more oppression. Whereas the American Revolution was basically an honest movement by people who were seeking more freedom, and in fact, they got more freedom once the revolution was completed.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation. Also, another factor that we had that when you come to some of the African countries, for example, that they did not have, we had a period of about 100 to 120 years of what the English called benign neglect. Basically, because of the time and distance, governors in America had to observe common law. They had to do what the people wanted, more or less, or they literally would be burned out of their homes, tarred and feathered. I mean, there were severe consequences for crossing the people and not doing what the people wanted. England maintained a kind of general tacit control that kept us from doing anything really stupid, like starting a war with Spain, for example. But other than that, the American colonies for about 150 years were more or less on their own. And I kind of liken it to the status of teenagers. You know, they have the keys to the house. They can come and go as they more or less please. They probably have a car where they can drive around in, but they can't mortgage the house to go up to Vegas and party for the weekend. So there's limitations on what they can do, but there's a great deal of freedom within those limitations. The African colonies did not have that. African colonies were ruled pretty much by England beginning to end, and not benign neglect, but just often just neglect. But they never had a chance to practice republicanism and self-democracy.
And they may not have had necessarily the antecedents of Christianity. All right, my guest is Larry Schweikart. He is the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the American Revolution. Larry, we're reaching the end of the program, so let my listeners know where they can get the book.
Sure. They can go to patriotshistoryusa.com, patriotshistoryusa.com. Amazon or any online bookseller, any local bookstore is probably going to have it.
All right, Larry, listen, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Great talk. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Look forward to talking to you again.
All right. Take care. Okay. So I shall return over at Tufts University, where I hold the fort every Thursday at 10 a.m. You can check out my books. They're available at Amazon.com. Just look it up by putting my name in the server, Chuck Morse, Morse, like Morse code. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon and take care.